Good morning.
Good morning.
Beautiful poppies from Placer County.
Beautiful. I love that.
Yes, somebody had, oh wait, it was Lucas and it was Star Wars last time.
Everybody
I don't
muted.
remember. And he gave
Millennium
me a hard
Falcon.
time.
Yeah.
Yes, because I said Star Trek. Well, wouldn't that be nice? Apparently the governor might make an announcement this morning about turning authority back to the counties. Ooh,
Who would have thought?
wouldn't that be nice? I think he's gotten a little bit of pushback. So we'll see what he says this morning.
He's supposed to brief the legislature at 11 on these new, whatever he's going to announce.
Well, we didn't wait, so we're that rebel force.
Yes, you are.
Yeah.
I didn't know Modoc County was in our NGO.
Bonnie Gore, she's our supervisor. Bonnie Gore, she's one.
Good morning. Hi. Let's see. And Renee, let us know when you think we've got most people here and on, from what you can tell.
Okay. Yeah, we're still waiting for a couple more. I'm just looking
Okay.
at the participant list to see if they're joining the other way.
Great. And of course it is not even 10 a.m. yet, so that's good.
And then I'll make an announcement to the attendees. If you are a board member and you're participating via telephonically, hit *9 so I know to promote you to a panelist.
Okay, good. I don't know why.
I'm not sure exactly why my screen says that I'm Tom Stollard, but
I just saw that. That's
We
interesting.
can
Mike.
rename you.
That mean I get 2
Names.
votes?
Yeah, Tom gets 2 votes. Well, hi.
I was kind of hoping that my name was going to be the same from my Zoom with my family. There it is, which said Governor Gaslight.
Are you having a cold spell up there in Folsom?
What is that
There's
backdrop,
like an
Mike?
igloo behind you.
That is Tatooine. It's May the
Yeah.
4th.
How's Aunt
Oh.
Beru?
Yeah.
It is May the 4th. May the force be with you, or the 4th be with you. That's
Oh.
right.
Okay, I believe, Chair Gore, that we do have everyone here. We are currently missing Director Allard, and he did indicate that he was going to participate. So I don't know if he's participating via telephonically, though. Director Allard, if you can hit *9, and then I'll know that you are calling in.
We'll give him a moment there, but it looks like we have most everybody. And if John does come on.
Starting. Hello out there.
Oh, is that John?
They have to do it by phone.
Nope, I don't know if that's John. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and get started, everyone. Good morning and welcome to the May 4th, 2020 meeting of the SACOG Policy and Innovation Committee. And of course, we'll take public comment via telephone, actually by Zoom, and they can zoom in, right? Renee, is that correct?
Yes, if they are participating telephonically, they would just hit *9, and then I will go ahead and pull them over to do a public comment, and they can also do the chat function as well if you're participating via Zoom online.
Perfect. Okay, so with that, we will go ahead and do the Pledge of Allegiance.
Hello.
I'm going to go ahead and share that flag really quick.
Oh, that would be great. Thank you. All right, let's go ahead and do the Pledge of Allegiance, and I'll go ahead and lead us. Stand up. All right. I pledge allegiance
I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the
of the
United
United
States of America and to the
and to the republic for
for
which
which
it
it
stands,
stands, one
one nation under God,
Under God.
indivisible,
indivisible,
liberty and
liberty and
justice for all. Thank you, everyone. All right, let's go ahead and have roll call, please.
Yes, let me. All right, as a reminder, this meeting is being recorded. And Directors Allard, absent. Douglas? Director Douglas, can you indicate that you're here? Okay, I'll let the record show that Director Douglas is present. Frericks?
Here, sorry about that.
That's okay, thank you so much. Kozlowski?
Here.
Leahy?
Here.
Lozano?
Here.
Saragosa?
I'm not getting a
Here.
good connection here.
Vice Chair Stallard?
here.
And Chair Gore.
Here.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining us via Zoom this morning. Appreciate you all spending your morning with us for the board meeting or the committee meeting. We will start with our first item, which is our consent agenda. And these are the minutes from March 30th. And unless anybody has any changes to those, we can take a motion.
Move approval of the agenda. Stallard.
Second, Saragosa.
All right, we have a motion and a second, and we'll do a roll call, please, Renee.
Okay. Directors Allard is absent. Douglas? Director Douglas, can you indicate if you vote, how you vote on the consent item for the minutes? Okay, I think he's having some audio issues there. I will go ahead and go to Frericks.
Aye, thank you.
Kozlowski?
Yes.
Leahy?
Yes.
Lozano?
Yes.
Saragosa?
Aye.
Vice Chair Stallard?
Aye.
And Chair Gore.
Aye. All right, motion passes. Thank you very much. We'll
Chair
move
Gore,
on
this is
to,
John Allard. I'm joining late. I apologize.
oh, great. Wonderful. Glad you can join us, John. Thank you for letting us know. Item 2, which is our action item, which is to adopt the final budget and overall work program for fiscal year 2020-2021. And looks like this might be Loretta.
Yes, I'm going to go ahead and pull her in and just give me one moment. All right, Loretta is present.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, good morning, Loretta.
Good morning. So this item is to recommend the board to adopt the final budget and OWP for fiscal year 2021. Just a quick background on the budget and OWP items. So staff submitted a draft budget and OWP for Caltrans and federal agencies review and comment in March. And the board approved the release of the draft for public comment at the April board meeting. So the final budget and OWP includes in this item incorporated comments and feedback from Caltrans and federal agencies. So far, no comments have been received from the public. Renee, can you move to the next slide, please?
Yes, sorry about that.
Okay, so this morning I'm just going to highlight some of the key changes from the draft to the final budget and OWP. So as I mentioned, the final OWP included in this item, which is attached to the item here, includes some of the comments from Caltrans and the federal agency. This includes update to the introductory sections to include SACOG needs, priorities, goals, and issues facing the regions. And also updated some project descriptions and tests and deliverables. The comments from Caltrans and the federal agency does not have any fiscal impact to the budgets, just minor update to toll credits and detailed budget tables. Attachment J is the summary of all the OWP comments and responses. And then attachment K, as I mentioned, is the final draft of the OWP that will go to the board later this month. Next slide, please. Here are some of the key changes to the final budgets. The final budget reflected a net revenue increase of 1.6 million. This includes the increased Connect Card revenue of 1.9 million, increased SAFE revenue of 258,000, and reduction in TDA revenue of 491,000. This assumes a 13% reductions, and I will discuss more in the forecast budgets later about TDA revenue. And then a reduced SB1 revenue of 70,000. The final budget also includes a request to use the reserve fund balance of 491,000 to backfill the reduction due to the TDA revenue. Next slide, please. Thank you. So just to recap, SACOG operates two budgets. The first one is the SACOG operation budgets, which includes the overall work program activities, the Capital Valley Regional SAFE budgets, the use of managed fund committed to projects, capital asset budget, and other local activities. The second budget is the Board and Advocacy budgets, which could be found in attachment I. That include board activities, federal and state advocacy work, and partnerships work. Next slide, please. So here is a summary of revenue broken down by various categories here. As you can see, SACOG received approximately 9.4 million of revenue from the federal governments. This including the transportations and planning funds, and also includes some of the discretionary grants. The state make up about 32% of total SACOG revenue. This includes SB1 funds, other discretionary and competitive grants, and also include the one-time regional housing funding. The local revenue makes up about 17%, and this includes the TDA fund. Service to other and other revenue makes up about 18%. This includes the SAFE and other miscellaneous revenue for SACOG. Next slide, please. This is an overview of SACOG operating expenditures by category. The total expenditure is approximately 27.3 million, resulted in an increase of 357,000 compared to fiscal year 1920. This is due to the deferred costs that carry over from the prior years. As you can see from the chart here, staff costs make up about 35% of the total expenditures. Consulting costs make up about 17%, this including consulting work related to the OWP activities and contract services for SAFE. Pass-through costs make up about 35% of the overall expenditures, and this includes the one-time pass-through costs for the housing program. Other and overhead makes up about remaining 10% of the budgets. For more detail, you can refer to attachment E, which is the overall work program project detail. Next slide, please. Here's an overview of the board and advocacy budgets. This budget is approximately 828,000. It's resulted in a 71,000 increase or 9%. This has resulted from the board fees increase that was approved by the board in March. Staff costs make up about 44% of the overall budgets. Board expense make up about 11% of the budgets. Advocacy is about 27%, and partnership is about 18%. Next slide, please, Renee. Thank you. So here's the next step. So as I mentioned, we're recommending that the board to adopt the final budget and OWP at the May board meeting. Once it's adopted, staff will submit the final budget and OWP to Caltrans and federal agency. With anticipated approval in June, we can start work plan activities and expenditures starting in July. As you know, there have been so many uncertainty about the financial impact due to the COVID-19. Staff is prepared to come back to the committees with a budget amendment in September timeframe. And I will discuss more detail about the budget amendments in the forecast budget items later. With that, I'm going to pause and see if there's any questions.
Questions from any of our directors? You said you were going to pause, Loretta, so you still have more, correct?
Not for this item here. So I have another item that is under the information item regarding the forecast budget for impact the SACOG, yes.
So I think probably the one thing we just want to make sure we touch base on so that people are aware, right? We're asking that we take what I don't have 490 some odd thousand, 471,000 from our reserves to meet the gap that we have as a result of what we anticipate from COVID related decrease in revenues, right? And so I think we want to make sure directors are aware of that. And if you could just give us the status on our revenues so we understand how much of those revenues we're taking to make up that gap and how much we would have left, I think that would be helpful.
Well, basically right now, the anticipated percentage that we built into the final budget is, as I mentioned, is 13% reduction in TDA revenue. At this point, we don't know exactly what the final reduction amount will be, but we know for sure there will be an impact because the TDA revenue is based on sales tax revenues. So depending on, the current situation would change and, daily, as you just mentioned earlier, that, the governor might be slowly opening back the economy again. So the impact, we just don't know at this point. So we kind of built in the 13% reduction, which resulted in a 491,000 in shortfall, which was asking the board to authorize us to use the reserve fund balance to backfill that gap right now. And when we're preparing the budget amendment, as we learn more about the impact, hopefully by September, we can come back to the board with different options of how to fill the gap, i.e. whether to use fund balance, reserve fund balance, or also looking at the overall expenditures and see we can, make any cuts in any of the expenditures also.
Great, thank you. And did you answer the question about the amount of reserves that we have currently and what would be left in those reserves if we authorize the 491,000?
Apologize. So yes, so we estimated that we have a unassigned, which is available, general reserve of approximately 3.5 million as of June 30th, 2020. So that is the, so we do have enough money in the reserve to use it to the backfill at least for the 491,000.
Great, thank you. So any questions from directors? And then, oh, there you are, Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, question on the reserve. What is that in terms of percentage? I mean, does that lower us to, 10% reserve, 5% reserve of our operating budget? If we take that 491,000, where does that put us in terms of our overall percentage of reserves versus the budget?
Well, our budgets right now, obviously, the budgets that I just showed you include a lot of past due costs in there. So one of the things that I am doing in the next item that I'm kind of looking at the overall SACOG operating budget, which is approximately a little bit over 19 million. just the SACOG operating side that it does not including the pass-through costs in there. So obviously with the 3.5 million there, if I just do a quick math.
That would be about 16%.
Yeah, 16 to 18% really is that. Yeah.
Any other questions from directors before I open it to the public? All right, we do have Jeff here, and I see Renee saying that we'll pull him in for public comment because he does have some questions. So if you want to go ahead and do that, Renee, that would be great.
I'm going to pull him in right now.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Jeff. Are you able to state your public comment?
Yes, you see it in the chat box, and it's basically, I've been participating in REMI and other forecasting tools and listening to what Transit is already talking about of 70%. So suggesting of whether you're planning for it or not, next year of a 50% budget is very, very likely. So in what terms you're looking at right now, I'm seeing, certain percentages. Are we expecting, something in the neighborhood of a 50% reduction in our sales tax for the region?
Good question, Jeff.
And I know you don't have to answer it now, just I flag it for you guys being government policy and related to SACOG.
I appreciate the question, Jeff. And let's see, I'm guessing we probably don't have any other public comment. Make sure we don't have any others. And if not, then Loretta, if you want to go ahead and answer that question, that would be great.
Okay. Well, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, obviously the actual impact, it's still kind of early to tell. But what what Jeff suggests, that the 49% impact, that I don't believe that will be impacted in SACOG budget, at least for the next fiscal year, because as I mentioned, only the TDA revenues and some of the SB1 funds is related to the sales tax. Other funding, like the funding that we receive from the federal government, those are sort of kind of formula-based fundings. So we don't anticipate any immediate impact in those revenue there.
Okay, but of course we will continue to track as we go along. This will be sort of a interactive process as we move along, as we hear what happens. All right, so we'll close public comment and bring this back to the directors. Any other discussion?
Bonnie, this is Lucas.
Yes, thanks, Lucas.
I just wanted to ask again. I apologize. Per Michael's question about what the percentage of reserve remains, and sort of, and I believe I heard Eric say 16%, but I wanted to just sort of again, so it's, we're proposing to use $500,000, roughly a little less than $500,000 in reserves to cover the balance that's needed, and that leaves about $3 million in reserves in the unassigned fund balance, if I'm not mistaken. And so I was just again curious what that percentage was.
Correct. So the reserves, there are multiple portions of the reserves, and we'd be happy to come back after Loretta covers the item on the forecast. Just to preview that, we'll have a much clearer sense of where we're at, and we probably will be amending this budget for the first time in September. And so we can go more deep into reserves at that point. But just to highlight a couple things, one, the unassigned fund balance that Loretta mentioned, as she said, that we are anticipating that will be at $3.5 million by June 30 of this year. So if we take down $500,000, that would leave $3 million, which is about 16% of our overall $19 million operating budget when you sub out those pass-through funds. This does not account for the SACOG Financing Corporation, the proceeds from the sale of the building, which the committee talked about last year, and we can talk about those sources as well as a more thorough review of the fund and what are restricted and assigned balances within the reserves as well.
Great. Okay. Great. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you, Eric. Any other questions? All right, so if not, then we can go ahead and ask for a motion to approve, and I have to go back to my agenda, which is to approve the final budget and overall work program for the fiscal year 2020-2021.
I'll move.
Who is that? A motion from
Michael.
Michael.
Second.
And do we
from
have a
Kozlowski.
second from Director Kozlowski? Yeah. Yeah. Kozlowski.
Mike Wazowski.
Yeah, Mike.
Say it fast.
All right, so we have a motion and a second. May I have a roll call, please?
Yes, Directors Allard? Allard, if you're present, can you indicate how you would like to vote on the item?
Allard votes aye.
Thank you. Douglas?
Yes.
Frericks?
Frericks, aye.
Kozlowski?
Yes.
Leahy?
Yes.
Lozano?
Yes.
Zaragoza?
Yes.
Vice Chair Stallard?
Yes.
And Chair Gore?
Yes.
Thank you.
Motion carries. Thank you very much, everyone. We'll move to item 3, which is our forecasted budget impacts to SACOG. All right, Loretta.
Thank you. Renee, can you bring the slide up? Thank you.
And Chair Gore and Directors, while the slides are coming up, I just wanted to sort of orient you. You know, that was an action item, obviously, to adopt the final budget. As Loretta and Eric both said, we know we're going to keep coming back and having to adjust this as the fiscal year proceeds. This is an information item to really kind of step back and in some ways give you a bit of the bigger picture and begin to give you some suggestion of the variation in the scenarios and the forecasting in terms of revenues. So we may have done this, you know, in advance of the action item, but because we want to do the action item first, this is sort of stepping back now and maybe answering some of the questions you and others have in terms of what's ahead. Okay, Loretta, thank you.
Thank you, James. Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, you know, there's so many impacts related to the COVID-19. You know, obviously, there's still a lot of unknowns. So this morning, my presentation on this item is focused on the immediate budget impact to SACOG overall operations. Renee, can you start the first slide? Next slide, please. Thank you. So as we see on the news every day, and just now that we, you know, this situation is just so fluid and change constantly. So it's just really hard to forecast the exact impact at this point because there's still a lot of unknown, you know, like the impact to the local business, the length of disruptions, the severity, and what the recoveries look like. You know, obviously you probably had seen about and talk about the different durations and the type of recovery, you know, which you might be familiar with, the V shape, the U shape. You know, these are representing the different type of recoveries. With the V shape, they're basically talking about a really sharp brief period of economic decline, but then it will back to normal in a couple months. And obviously with the U shape, they're talking about a longer recession that could have a recovery period from, you know, 5 years to 10 years, depending on how bad it is. You know, obviously if you're comparing to the 2008 Great Recession, that could be a 10 years recovery period. So, you know, since there's so many unknowns, so this morning, as I mentioned, that we're going to be focused on the immediate impact to SACOG, which is the sales tax revenue, or i.e. the TDA revenue that SACOG receives. Renee, can you move to the next slide? So to start, I just want to give an overview of a SACOG revenue and then kind of discuss the estimated impact to the budget based on the different categories of revenue that I shown in this table here. Just to note that this revenue summary includes both the operations and the board budgets. but we're excluding the past due revenue. So just to kind of more focus a little bit on SACOG operating budgets. So as you can see, we receive about 42 million revenue from the federal. As I mentioned, these are transportation and planning funds, and also include some of the discretionary grant. We currently don't anticipate any immediate impact, especially for fiscal year 2021. For the state, we receive about 13% or 2.5 million. This is mainly the SB1 fund. There again, we don't anticipate any impact in the fiscal year 2021. However, the SB1 fund is based on gas tax, so we will see an impact probably in the following year on that. And then local revenue, which makes up about 27% of SACOG revenue, and 21% of those revenue are from TDA revenue. And this is the category where we feel that there will be a significant impact to SACOG budgets. And then 18%, oh, sorry, can you go back one? Sorry, and then the last one is 18% from the service to other, this including the SAFE and board budgets. And as I mentioned, this one, we don't anticipate any immediate impact either. Next slide, please. Thank you. Next slide. Oh, sorry. Can you go back to the expenditures? Yes, this one here. Sorry about that. Okay, so also just to kind of provide an overview of SACOG expenditures by categories, and then what some of the potential impact would be due to the reduction in revenue. Again, I just want to point out that this includes both the expenditures from the operations and the board budgets. As you can see, staff costs make up about 58% of the SACOG operating budgets, and these are mostly fixed costs. Consulting costs is about 26% of the budgets. This including consulting services for activity related to the work plan, but also contracted service for SAFE that is related to the 511 site and call center. And then overhead represent about 11% or 1.7 million of expenditures for SACOG. And these are also mostly fixed costs like the building expenses. Other costs make up the remaining 5% of the budgets. Next slide, please. Again, in addition to the anticipated reduction in sales tax revenue, there are also some orders, sales tax orders that could also impact the short-term cash flow and the timing of getting the information from the county. So currently there are 2 orders out there right now. One is the 90-day sales tax deferral, which will be in effect until July 31st, which means that, so usually the sales tax returns that the county and the cities are receiving would not be, for the second quarter, probably will be going into the third quarter. And then also the defer up to 50,000 tax liability up to 12 months, interest and penalty free for small businesses. So obviously with these 2 orders, it will impact one, the timing of the cash flow. Secondly, also we affecting the timing of getting the actual information. So what we anticipated that in June, that the final receipt for the first quarter or January through March will be known. At that time, the county will be calculating and updating the final 19-20 sales tax revenue, and then also forecasting fiscal year 2021 projections. So at that time, we would have some preliminary number estimate on the TDA revenue. Then also, just with these 2 orders, the information for the second quarter's taxes will be delayed. The earliest that we think that we'll have the information probably will be in the late August, September timeframe, where the county will have the final receipt of the April to June sales tax revenue. And then also at that time, they can finalize the revenue for fiscal year 19-20, and then provide update on the fiscal year 2021 projections in terms of the sales tax revenue. Next slide, please, Renee. Thank you. Okay, as I mentioned, because there's still so many unknown and uncertainties, we just don't know exactly how big of an impact this TDA revenue would have on SACOG. So what we did here was that we kind of did some scenarios. So when we started the fiscal year 2021 budget, we started off with approximately about 3.8 million of TDA revenue. Of course, that was prior to the COVID-19. Because of these unknown, we have calculated the certain different percentage of reductions. If you look at the table here, so if it's a 10% reductions, that will result in a 377,000 in reduced TDA funding. If it's a 15% reduction in sales tax revenue, that could result in a 565,000 in TDA revenue for SACOG. If you're looking at maybe 25%, that could potentially about 941,000 impact to SACOG. If the recession is going to be longer and it's kind of similar to the 2008, the Great Recession, that could result in about 41% reduction, which means about 1.5 million revenue reduction for SACOG. Because of all these unknown, when we were preparing the final budget, we assumed a 13% reduction, which is the estimate of 491,000 reduction in revenue that is built into our current budget. And that's where we asking the board to authorize SACOG staff to use the reserve fund balance to cover that for now. And then until we have better information, then we'll bring back more detail. So, the 13% reduction at that time was based on third-party economic forecasts, but, that number could change and, it's just changing every day, and it could be going up as high as 20% or it could be lower. We just don't know and don't have all the information at this point. Renee, next slide, please. So what we are doing, so what's the next step? So obviously we're just continuing monitoring the current economic conditions and continuing to work on forecasts. And then our hope is to report back to the policy and innovation committees and board regularly on forecast impacts to SACOG. We will be reviewing, assess the impact of the type of revenue and then related expenditures. As I mentioned earlier, that the revenue category that I show is based on federal, state, and local. So our next step is to kind of evaluating the type of revenue, which means how much of those are formula revenues, how much are discretionary, how much is depending on the sales tax and all the other source of revenue SACOG receives. Next slide, please. So our next step also is we anticipated that by September, we'll be able to bring back a budget amendment once we know the second quarter sales tax revenue informations. At that time, we will be closing out, fiscal year 1920 and be able to revise fiscal year 2021 budget with new revenue projections and then develop options to cover the shortfall, using the use of reserve funds or reduction in expenditures. So we were looking at all different scenarios and options, and obviously also to assess work plan impacts and priorities. With that, I'm gonna pause and see if there's any questions that I can answer.
Directors, any questions for Loretta? Nope, hearing none. And I don't think we've got any questions from our public. And if we do, you can let us know by typing in that you want to be brought in. Okay, Loretta, anything else that you wanted to share?
Nope, that's all for now. And then as I mentioned, as we learn more about the current situation, we'll bring back information to the committees.
Great. Thank you for the update. Appreciate it. Like you said, it'll be fluid and we'll have to continue to just watch the impacts on our budgets. So obviously more to come.
Yes.
All right, let's move to item 4, which is the advocacy update. Good morning, Christina.
I'm going to pull Christina in right now.
Okay. And I just want to point out Monica Hernandez's "We Can Do It" Rosie the Riveter backdrop. Thumbs up like that. All right, Christina, we can see you.
All right, just unmuting. I think I'm unmuted now. Excuse me. Hi, good morning. I'm going to provide an update on federal, state, and then an in-depth on Green Means Go today for my advocacy update. First, starting on the federal side, the Senate is back today for regular business for the first time in more than 5 weeks. Their schedule this week obviously is focused on corona-related hearings, and they're also going to have hearings on confirming presidential nominees. The House is currently targeting a return for next Monday, although that still appears to be somewhat tentative based on some calls they had in the last couple of days with the House physician. They are also looking at adopting voting by proxy to try to reduce the number of members in the Capitol and having to travel. On the state side, we're seeing a little bit of a similar process in terms of both houses not necessarily being on the same page. At the state capitol, the assembly is coming back today, although members that are older than 65 or have pre-existing conditions are being excused from having to return. The Senate so far is scheduled to come back next Monday on May 11th. However, that is also still tentative. The Assembly is resuming their policy committee hearings today as they return. But as you can imagine, the process is going to be very, very different. They only just last week finally settled on their process and released their hearing schedule. Each committee is only going to have one hearing to hear all of their bills. Bills will be referred to only one policy committee. Previously, bills could have been referred to 2 or more, sometimes 3 committees. They're also going to have strict social distancing procedures in place. For example, they're going to limit the number of people in committee rooms. They're encouraging people to testify by phone and video conference link. And they've also significantly reduced the number of bills they plan to hear, although not necessarily limiting bills to those related to the pandemic. It does vary a little bit based on committee. They are staggering the hearings from today through May 21st so that they can be held in their large committee rooms or in the assembly chambers. If the bill has a fiscal impact to the state, if it passes out of policy committee, which many probably will just based on the circumstances, then it will need to be heard in the Appropriations Committee, and the Assembly has not yet outlined what the process is for hearing bills in appropriations. The Assembly has also tentatively removed all of their policy bill deadlines and their July summer recess from the calendar, because if you remember, their existing legislative deadlines require policy committees to have acted on bills by May 1st. So obviously we've missed that deadline. So if they want their bills to move forward, they are going to have to adjust those rules. Those rules are set by the House, by the Assembly and the Senate, so they are able to adjust those. Just a quick reminder, the only deadlines that are in the Constitution that can't be changed is the June 15th budget deadline, and then also the end of session deadline on August 31st. Looking a little bit at the Senate, they have yet to update their calendar or finalize their committee hearing process. They are, like I said, supposed to return on May 11th. I think they're a little bit more hesitant to return. Particularly, they have more older members, and they're trying to figure out exactly how they can return and ensure the health and safety of their members, the public, and their staff. Before they left, they did set up procedures to, they voted to allow the Senate to set up procedures to vote remotely, which is different than what the Assembly did. So I think that's also playing into their discussions and trying to figure out exactly how they're going to proceed. Both the Assembly and the Senate, as we said before, did hold a couple of budget hearings in the interim, focused specifically on the pandemic. Related to the budget, the governor is expected to release his updated proposed budget next week. And as we've shared before, it'll largely mirror the current budget year, but could potentially include already identified needed cuts. The legislature has not yet identified their process for the budget this year. Typically, budget items go through a lengthy subcommittee process before going to the full budget, and then a conference committee, and then a vote on the floor. Obviously, with that June 15th deadline and just everything that's going on, the budget process is going to have to be changed pretty significantly. I've heard conversations that they'll either just have a full budget hearing without the subcommittee process, or maybe even just go straight to the conference committee process before it goes to the floor. And as I mentioned, they do have to pass a budget by June 15th. As we've been talking about in terms of with Green Means Go, the governor and legislature are expected to revisit the budget in August after tax receipts are due on July 15th, and they have a better picture of the state's fiscal situation. Moving on now to Green Means Go, we continue to move forward with our Green Means Go advocacy. The main component I think to remember and stress is that our proposal calls for using existing funds, which obviously is now critical as the state is looking at a major loss in revenue. And just a reminder, the state can't make money like the federal government, and they have to have a balanced budget. And so when we're in the situation where their tax receipts are coming in much less than what their expenditures were planned to be, obviously the only thing they can do is cut, so it's a little bit of a different conversation that they're having than the federal government. Due to the change in the budget process that I mentioned, we are looking for our advocacy to center on the August budget. And given the nature of Green Means Go, we're also looking at framing it in terms of economic recovery and stimulus. And so we're turning our attention to the governor's task force on business and jobs recovery and highlighting Green Means Go as a potential economic recovery tool. This is a new tactic since KP, our lobbyist, gave an update to the board last month. The day after the board meeting, the governor announced this new task force. The task force is co-chaired by Ann O'Leary, the governor's chief of staff, and Tom Steyer, and it includes over 80 members of the governor's cabinet and public and business officials as well. The task force will work to develop actions that the government and businesses can take to help Californians recover as fast as possible from the COVID-19 induced recession, and also mentions a number of times in the press release to shape a fair, green, and prosperous future. They're planning to meet twice a month throughout the year, and the governor stated that the idea is to craft ideas for short, medium, and long-term solutions to help reflect communities all across the state, while also emphasizing a fair and equitable recovery. So the task force is not going to just focus on our immediate recovery, but also actions to support, again, a cleaner and more equitable, prosperous future for all of California. It is being staffed by the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development, GoBiz, which previously worked on the Governor's Regions Rise initiative, which is also conducive to Green Means Go. And we had previously briefed GoBiz and the staff on the programs. And so, sorry, I got distracted by the chat. And so we do think that focusing on the task force is a good place to spend our efforts because of how much it aligns with what we're trying to do with Green Means Go. And as you have now hopefully seen, we are going to be submitting a letter to the task force from the local elected officials in our region, identifying Green Means Go as a potential model. We would like to get as many local elected officials from our region to sign on as possible. If you haven't already, please let me know that you'd like to sign on, and please encourage your colleagues to sign on as well. We have a quick turnaround time. We're hoping to finalize the letter today. So I want to thank you all for your quick responses. I believe most of this committee has actually already agreed to sign on. So thank you for that. Concurrently, we're also planning to submit a letter from our legislative delegation. Our lobbyists are working with Senator Pan and others to circulate a slightly different but similar letter for our delegation to sign onto to send to the task force. And then thirdly, we've asked our local stakeholders to send in a letter as well, and we've provided them with a sample letter to use. So the main thing right now is to continue to keep up Green Means Go in the minds of our legislators, and really particularly focus with the emphasis on using existing funds. As I've had some conversations with legislative staff about Green Means Go, I've realized it's helpful to remind them that this isn't new funds that we're asking for. We're just asking for using existing funds, but giving our region its fair share. So that's my update.
Thank you, Christina. Appreciate the update. Any directors have any questions for Christina? All right, and thank you everyone for signing on to the Green Means Go letter. We appreciate that. Let's see.
Director Saragosa had a comment.
Go ahead, Michael, if you are.
Yep.
There.
Can you hear?
Yes.
Okay. Question on the task force. So I know the task force is now also broken into subcommittees. Do we know who the chair and vice chair is? I guess this would fall under infrastructure, but to the extent we know that, we might be able to focus our advocacy efforts a little bit more sharper too if we have those chairs and vice chairs. Like I know housing is Alani Kounalakis, and then I think Doug McCarron from the Carpenters. So if there's an infrastructure one, we should look into seeing who the who those chair and co-chairs are on the committee. Thank you.
Sorry. Yeah, there's a number of committees, subcommittees that the task force, as you can imagine, with a task force with over 80 members, there's a number of subcommittees that I think are relevant for Green Means Go that we've been focusing in on. And that's a really good reminder to focus in on those chairs and vice chairs as well.
And then just also on our partners, I don't know if we've reached out to California Building Trades for their to get a letter of support from the trades as well. I'm happy to help with that if we need that, but we should get it to the extent we can get our construction trade unions to weigh in on this. It would be helpful.
Yes, so right now at the local level, we have a wide range of stakeholders that have signed on in support, including our local building trades. Their person has spoken with state building trades, and as well the state's the building trades ledge person is now working for the pro tem, and so some conversations have already been happening with CESAR about Green Means Go at that level as well.
Great, thank you for the input, Michael. Appreciate that. Any other directors have comments? And if not, we can also open this up to the public if there are any comments from the public. I saw James about to open his mouth and maybe say something.
You're seeing the future on May the 4th. It's good. Anticipating Chair Gore. So I just wanted to also just, while this is the big push, as you're all aware, and Christina has described at the state level, to try to continue to get our region on the radar screen of the legislature, of this task force. Just a reminder too, that we are also working diligently to try to ready the region for potential federal infrastructure stimulus bill. And great partnership on this one, PCTPA, EDCTC, a lot of our partners in water and flood control. So we are putting together a list for the region of things that are kind of projects that are ready to go. I think Christina's mentioned this in the past. To be very clear, it is not at all a given that this will happen, but in many ways we want to be ready in case it does. So that's an ongoing effort. We've extended the deadline on those projects until about May 22nd, but we're hoping to get that list in and ready, in part to be ready for a potential federal bill, but frankly also to give to our congressional delegation so that they can actually speak articulately again about our region and what we might do with any stimulus funding. So I just want you all to be aware of that, given all the boards and committees that you all sit on, and yeah, more to come.
Great, thank you, James. Appreciate that. Any other comments from directors? All right. Thank you, Christina. We will move to item.
We actually do, my apologies for the interruption. We do have a public comment. I'm going to bring Jeff in again to allow him to give his comment.
Great, thank you, Renee.
Hi, Jeff. Are you able to make the comment that you wanted to? I think he might have muted himself.
Can you hear me now?
We can. Thank you so much. And Jeff, I'm so sorry. For the record, can you state your first and last name? I forgot to ask you for that in your previous public comment.
I apologize. This is Jeff Tartagia, and right now I'm representing Cara, and just wanted to update, if you weren't aware, that at the last week's assembly hearings, Transit really made an emphasis that they knew they needed to be funded because of the decrease in all transportation revenue. The other thing that you mentioned, that Senate was going to be not starting until next week, they're actually having this week, Wednesday, a meeting related to the coronavirus. So don't know if anybody needs to speak to that. I will let James know about another conversation coming from the functional office of the Vance, who's facilitating a weekly meeting related to the problems related to the coronavirus. But just an update to you is of what is going on. And right now I'm listening to the assembly hearing related to health impacts and panels going on right now. So that's why there is a delay in me responding to you, because I'm listening to 2 Zoom calls at once.
Well, thank you, Jeffrey. We appreciate the feedback and the input, and always appreciate your participation. Okay, so we will go ahead and move to item 5, which is the regional telework long-term support for employers and employees. Good morning, Monica.
Good morning, Chair. Thank you for having me today. I'm excited about this item. Today we have a tee-up discussion that is really future-oriented and considers what SACOG can do to maintain some levels of the telework that we have seen under the shelter-in-place orders. We know that these orders are being rolled back and that we are going to be transitioning to a new normal. Oh, I'm sorry, Renee, can you go ahead and pause that? That won't come up till later, thank you. Or you can leave it on that title slide, sorry. So today, I really have 3 components to the presentation. First, a little bit of framing and context relative to telework. Second, a look at what shelter-in-place has done to our regional vehicle miles traveled. And then finally, I'd like to engage with this committee on a discussion to get your insights and feedback as we ramp up, develop, and test new programs that attempt to retain telework that was currently required. So first, with the context and the framing for this item. I've heard COVID referred to as an accelerant both with negative and positive outcomes. And I think this is a perfect example. Years of advocacy have failed to make telework a viable benefit to many, many employees. According to Pew Research, prior to COVID-19, only about 7% of the civilian workforce had access to flexible schedules or the telework benefit. Under normal circumstances, telework really is considered a benefit and a viable commute option. And at SACOG, amongst our very popular programs like May is Bike Month, we have made efforts to promote telework with employers, and it really hasn't landed well. We hear lots of rationale as to why telework is not a viable option. And so while it's not just available to a small group of employees nationally, of that group of employees, it really is available to those folks who are higher wage earners, as referred to and noted in the Brookings report, which was attachment A to the staff item. So every day in this environment is a new challenge, but there are some assumptions that we can make, and I feel comfortable kind of discussing as context to our thinking. So we know that our public schools are not going to reopen for the remainder of the year, which will likely lead to there not being the summer programs that many families rely on for childcare. So creating a continued demand on telework. And whether you work for a public agency or a private agency, the physical spaces that we work in will also operate differently. There will likely need to be work in place, physical distancing, new standard operating procedures that would need to be developed to reduce the transmission of likelihood. And one of the areas that I've been exploring is that some people will have tried telework for the first time and have actually been successful, maybe even thrived under a telework option. I've heard anecdotally from a few colleagues that if it were not for the demands of kids at home currently, and also just the mental stress of being in a pandemic and trying to work at the same time, that they could see themselves being more open to telework, and they can see the opportunity for increased productivity. An important thing I want to note is that many organizations, public and private, rushed to adopt telework procedures and implement them, and are probably still missing some key components, strong cybersecurity systems, IT protocols and policies, some of the safety protocols that are supposed to be in place while teleworking may not be implemented or observed. So in that realm, we're looking to increase our knowledge about those factors and see how we might be able to assist through technical assistance and or incentive programs to maintain some level of telework in the future. So Renee, if you'll tee up the slideshow, please. So next, we're gonna walk through our regional VMT. So thanks to Bruce Griesenbeck and his team for getting the available data right now together, and AJ Tendick, who takes our challenging and complex data tables and puts them into more visually appealing slides. So next slide, please, Renee. I want to note that the data team is still assessing and analyzing the available data so that we can look at what's happening on our roadways. So if you'll hit space, thank you. So looking first at what our regional weekday vehicle miles travel were pre-COVID. So we were looking at about 60 million miles, and those miles include everything: commute, errands, all types of trips. So next slide, please. And now let's look at the early weeks of March. So March 14th, that is right around when the Bay Area was initially launching their shelter in place. And you can start to see a bit of a dip here. And I believe some workplaces were responding to the Bay Area before any statewide or specific actions were taken. Next slide, please. And then you can see the week of March 21st, after our local shelter-in-place orders, our daily VMT plummets by nearly a half, from 60 million to 30 million. Next slide, please. And then the following weeks, to present, you can see we are below 20 million miles. And the roads are currently seeing about 1/3 of the normal vehicle travel. And I do recognize that this plummet in VMT does come with massive economic hits to the region that will be felt well into the future, but there is still an opportunity to retain some of that and how we might create some benefits to our roadways, including cost savings on wear and tear if wear and tear is going down. Next slide, please. So you can see clearly a reduction, about 71% overall. And as we look ahead, we want to think about and engage with all of you, what might it look like if we could retain potentially about 10% of that telework? So we're not looking at trying to retain this anomaly of a number. Where we are right now, we don't see that as a realistic future. We don't want that. We know all of the negatives that come along with that. So what are some factors that could potentially help us achieve higher levels of telework as shelter in place is repealed and we are getting our economy kicked back up? So things that could push VMT higher. You see, we have the two green bars. We have, what if we can see 10% increase in telework? And what if we don't actually see that? What if we see more people driving alone? What are those things that could cause more people driving alone? One, not taking an advantage of that telework. Also, folks, we've potentially fearing getting back on transit and not going back to riding transit at the numbers that they are riding right now. We are concerned about that, and we know that transit operators are working really hard to adapt so that they can still be a viable option. What could help us leverage that telework? One is actually creating programs and a goal of retaining levels of telework. Transit does change its operation, so it does bring back more riders. And then, of course, workplaces offering more alternatives. So when we think of flexible work schedule, it is not just the telework option, but it's transit, driving, telework, bike, and parking kind of being presented as a bundle. And I really target the workplace here because regardless if an employee wants to telework or ride their bike or use a different thing than driving, unless the workplace facilitates that either through programs or just flexibility. For example, if I ride transit and I happen to miss my bus, if it's not a big deal that I'm coming in 15 minutes later. I recognize that that doesn't work for all types of workers. So that really is a part of our thinking as well. We recognize that telework doesn't work for all. So we have this current short-term anomaly that gives us the opportunity to reflect and respond. So the benefits of this reduced VMT, not just the reduction of wear and tear, we could see a longer reduction or a benefit of reducing wear and tear if we reduce the number of vehicles on cars regularly. And we can also look at this as a congestion option. You'll remember in 2019, Bruce had a number of workshops on congestion pricing that we see that in the Bay Area. We also see toll pricing all over the East Coast where drivers pay their fees and they might increase or decrease on congestion based on congestion. So if it's a high congestion day, to get through the lane, you pay a higher fee. Well, what if we had a future where telework is an alternative to that driving? So we would have an app on our phone that daily would send us a notification that it's a high congestion day. Here's the fees you're gonna pay. An employee might be able to, at that point, opt into their telework options if in place with their employer. And we're really looking at how a work day, or excuse me, a work week could be looked at with multiple ways to get to work. So it could be a combination of telework, a combination of driving alone, a transit pass. Currently, the way a lot of these programs operate, it's a one all or nothing. So for example, you start a job, you might get offered free parking by the month, or you can get a transit pass per month. But that doesn't really support somebody having the flexibility they might need if they have a parent that they're caring for. They might need to get 2 days of parking. They might want 1 day of transit and 2 days of telework. So we're really looking to reinvigorate the way our employers around the region help their staff commute and really diversify that. So first, I can pause here on this information, and I have Bruce ready in the queue should any of your questions get beyond my technical capacity. And then once we can move on into the discussion I would hope to entertain this committee with.
Okay, any questions for Monica?
Monica, this is Mike Kozlowski. I have one. Just in the scenario where people take advantage of more remote work, I guess the thing that popped into my head immediately when you started talking about this is what the impact would be on a funding model that relied on vehicle miles traveled and the congestion pricing that we were talking about all through last year. So I'm wondering if there's any current data on other places where there is congestion pricing and what deficit that has created in their funding model that we need to make sure that we at least plan for as a potential problem in the future.
That's a great question.
Like optimistic negative question,
No, it's very important. I'm glad you asked that. I'll start with, I don't have the answer, but that is another area that we are thinking about, because if we have forecasted and we are reliant on that congestion pricing to help with our maintenance, if we're looking at that as a cost, to all new capacity projects, we would need to definitely understand that. And I think where we are with the planning, right, we can't use our current condition because this will not be our new normal. So I know Bruce is listening, so we definitely have that noted and we've been thinking about it, but we don't know. Is not a great answer, but it's the truth right now. You're still muted, Director Kozlowski. I think you were.
I'm mute now. Okay. Yeah, I didn't expect you to have a brilliant prepared answer for that one, but you brought it up and it was the first thing that popped into my head when we started talking about this because of all the other discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Ooh, Madam Chair, you're muted also.
Okay, now I'm unmuted. Thank you. Any other questions from directors? I actually really appreciate this update, Monica. It's really helpful to understand what's happened during this time with VMT and even what we anticipate it looking like if we actually encourage telework, which I think people will see the value of being able to have some flexibility and allowing that for their employers. Where it's workable. We've seen that it's workable. Other questions from folks? All right, why don't you continue on then, Monica?
Great, thank you. And then that's the end of the slides, Renee. Thank you. So I hope you had an opportunity to look at the framing document. One thing that I want to emphasize is that as we look at revamping a lot of the programs that have existed and we know work and some that we know don't, we are wanting to apply the design thinking approaches that we have used in Civic Lab. So most importantly with that is listening. So we want to do immediately, and we've already listened to a few stakeholders, but we need to do a little bit more listening, but we need to do that at we think a very rapid pace, which is also part of that design thinking prototyping. It's working fast. We want to ideate, prototype, and then deploy some of these solutions. So as I said earlier, starting at the workplace is really important because it doesn't matter what an employee wants as an alternative if the employment center doesn't offer those. And we understand that there are significant differences for various types of jobs. We know that you can't have a staff of remote workers if you have a restaurant or a gas station, and there are many, many places like that. So I don't want it to come across that we are trying to do this blanket telework. We know it doesn't work for everybody. We know that there are significant challenges with generally who has access to telework, and we want to understand how we might be able to expand that to more diverse wage earners. And then we're also not really aware of how this could potentially create more employment or improved employment opportunities for people with disabilities or limited English proficiency, because you would be working in a truly, technology based. And of course, there are major issues with access to broadband for our rural communities as well. So if you looked through the framing document, I put in there some questions to the committee. I'm happy to jump into those, or if there is a broader discussion that the committee is interested in, or Madam Chair, we do have some ideas of what programs could look like, but and I'm happy to share those. But again, back to our design thinking process, those approaches that have been so successful in Civic Lab, we don't want to start developing this program based on what we've known in the past. We want to talk with stakeholders. The Metro Chamber has expressed immediate interest and support, as well as the Greater Sacramento Economic Council, to help us get together with some of their private sector employers. So I can jump into those questions that I framed under opportunities and challenges, the key partners and stakeholders, Or Madam Chair, if you wish to go in another direction, I'm happy to do that as well.
Well, let's go ahead and talk about the questions that you've posed. And they are, if folks are looking, you can get them on in your agenda packet. So yeah, go ahead, Monica, let's lead the discussion and let's see if folks have some input for you.
Great. I'll put a pause first if anybody was ready to jump in. If not, I can kind of pepper in with some observations.
Right, so the questions were, what type of opportunities and challenges do you foresee relative to maintaining varying levels of telework? I think that, wait.
Yes.
My computer is slow. Evaluation and measurement, what would we like to see? There might be another one, but my computer is slow.
And then also questions about, who might be missing in terms of stakeholders or partners, what barriers you see. That's something I'm interested in. We'll be reaching out to public sector staff as well, because again, there are very different needs in the public sector and the private sector. And what benefits or outcomes would you anticipate or like to see?
Great. All right, folks, feel free to chime in.
I have a couple of comments.
Yes.
In terms of the opportunities and challenges, obviously, like was just mentioned, private and public sector are going to have two different issues, but I think both are going to have issues of a different way to supervise people. You have a lot of first line supervisors, middle managers, and certainly executives that have, that are post 50 years old. And this is all new territory for them. I should say us. And, I think that's one of the things that's really going to have to be stressed as companies and or government agencies are really going to have to put together a nice policy package to address some of these new workplace environments that we haven't been used to in the last, however many years we've been working. And so that's going to be one of the challenges. I think the other challenge is going to be, what type of flexibility is there going to be? And certainly it's going to depend on the type of job and or the industry, but, building in those parameters for telework and making sure those expectations are up front. And then lastly, I just think that we really need to look at the economic impact that it's going to have on the region. It will help with vehicle miles traveled, but it may also hurt the local economy in terms of sales tax revenue and things like that. So I think we can't be blind to all of it and make sure that we at least address that as we move forward.
Thank you.
Thanks, Director Lozano. Any other comments, input from directors?
I have one thing. My normal job, I spend a lot of time thinking about school district operations, and that I think probably up until this incident felt like one particular bit of public industry that was very resistant to telework. But I can imagine some scenarios where there are persistent uses of distance learning because it will give school districts an opportunity that they may not have had in the past to have a wider array of teachers available to them. And students have a wider array of classes available to them. And I think this is a little test case right now. Schools will generally go back to teaching in person, but there's no reason why certain subjects wouldn't be just as well delivered remotely.
Well, and on top of that, right, like our universities, our colleges, Sierra College is going to go virtually all online this next semester. So it does change the ability for higher education institutions and what they can provide online, fewer people maybe traveling from Placer County or Folsom to Sac State if they've got online classes. So it'll be interesting to see how that affects all of this as well.
One other thing, it wouldn't surprise me at all if the number of parents and or teachers who are uncomfortable with sending their kids or themselves back to a school setting in the fall means that school districts continue to do distance learning. The K-12 districts continue to do K-12 distance learning well into the end of this year, and maybe through most of next school year. Because trying to do both at the same time will be very challenging, having some kids in the school and some doing remote. So like I said, it wouldn't surprise me if we end up having the benefit of teachers staying home and students staying home for a longer period of time, even though that creates a whole cascade of supervision issues for parents.
Comments from other directors? Input, suggestions?
Tom Stallard.
Go ahead, Tom.
I'd just like to weigh in to say that I think this is a very interesting and timely initiative. I think we're all learning new things, and some of those new things are worthy of continuing following the COVID crisis. I do appreciate Rich Lozano's points. You know, I'm a commercial landlord, among other things, and I obviously don't want people abandoning commercial tenancies. There's already quite a number of pressures with online shopping and everything else growing dramatically. But I find people still do like their offices. So if we can still manage to maintain our community centers and places of employment without degrading those efforts, I think telemeeting is nice. I think most of us are learning it's actually a nice way to do business. It saves getting in the car and driving somewhere. I haven't been to downtown Sacramento in 7 weeks. This is a first.
Yeah.
That may not be good for downtown Sacramento. No parking revenue, you know,
right.
No coffee, whatever.
Yeah, the benefits also have other impacts that are unanticipated, or we need to anticipate them.
But that doesn't mean we need to be afraid of going forward. And I think a blend is obviously a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Could be a good thing.
Yes.
Thank you.
If I could just reiterate and emphasize that blend. And right now it's the space where we can kind of get our foot in the door using the telework experience. But an optimal scenario, in my opinion, is one where people have multiple options of flexibility, including still maintaining the opportunity to drive their personal vehicle when they want to drive their personal vehicle, the flexibility to be able to use transit, the flexibility to be able to bike if it's feasible. And there are certainly unintended consequences or challenges that we will see. But we've also heard in the big interest from the Greater Sacramento Economic Council and the Metro Chamber is this type of work environment is one factor that helps retain and attract a talented workforce and boost productivity for workers when they have that flexibility. And you know, we want to promote that it's not you have to do all one type of mode as a commute option, that you can have a bundle of options to create that flexibility, and then again reduce the strain on our roadways and hopefully reduce those costs of maintenance over time.
Thanks, Monica. Let's see if there's else from directors. We do have a comment from Jeffrey from the public, so we can open this up to the public.
Okay, I'm going to be pulling Jeff in right now to make his public comment.
Hi, this is Jeffrey. One of the underlying things that for 10 years I've worked with Dorothy Matsui, and right now working and reminding the governor's office, is we have to have a reliable, dependable, and broadband internet service to do all of these things. I appreciate Henry Lee producing, 10 buses that will provide some degree of more high power hotspots, but only for 4 hours is not nearly enough to address really one of the things that, and it may be something that transportation is going to become more aware of and a helpful service in the future, because Wi-Fi needs, as you may experience, and I've experienced repeatedly even with these Zooms, I have it cut out at various points because just the connection is not that dependable and that broad to handle the load that it's under right now.
Right. Thank you very much, Jeffrey. We appreciate that comment. And I think we even noticed that with Director Douglas first thing, right, this morning, him trying to get better connection as he got onto our into our board or our committee meeting today. All right, we'll close public comment and we can move to, did you have anything else, Monica, or is it time to move to item number, I believe it's 6?
That's all for me. I will be back in June in front of this committee with more updated information. We hope to have a more specific framework for the types of programs we're going to initiate. As a reminder, this type of work was already in our work plan, but slated for late 2020, early 2021. So the accelerated timeline, of course, we will also be presenting, or I will be presenting this to the Transportation Committee as well, but neither group needs to take action for us to be able to keep moving this work forward.
Great, thank you, Monica, appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Let's move to item 6, which is policy framing for 2020 for SACOG regional funding round. And this is Garrett and Matt.
Well, good morning. My name is Garrett Baudrosa with SACOG. This item is really kicking off the board's multi-month policy discussion about what approach to take to the 2020 funding round. It is going as an info item to all 3 committees. Matt Carpenter and I jointly prepared this item, and generally we do a tag team presentation, but Zoom isn't the most conducive for those dual presentations. So I'll give the staff presentation today, but both Matt and I will be on for any questions during the board's or the committee's discussion to answer. Really what this item does is lay out some of the key issues sort of affecting the board's policy deliberation for the 2020 funding round. But before we go into those issues themselves, I did want to take a step back and remind ourselves what we mean by the 2020 SACOG funding round. The SACOG round is where the board acts on how they'll award the agency's share of discretionary transportation revenues coming primarily from state and federal sources. It's a major way that the agency implements our long-range plan. It's a major part of our work program. But as a reminder, this transportation funding round is just for projects in the 4-county region, so Sacramento, Sutter, Yolo, and Yuba counties. In that, transportation projects in Placer and El Dorado counties have separate funding programs through PCTPA and EDCDC. Just as a reminder of that background. At the onset of each round, the board engages in this exercise you'll be undertaking today on sort of what approach to take to the round and sort of your policy priorities and the trade-offs within that approach. Since for some context, since the blueprint over 15 years ago, the board has elected for a competitive approach to the round, the transportation funding round, where the board makes an action on a framework. This is an action we'd ask for you to be taking next month on sort of what are the programs within the round and the policy priorities. Once that framework action is taken by the board, staff then releases a call for projects across the various programs. We then form evaluation working groups consisting of both SACOG staff and external professionals, experts to evaluate those submitted projects. Then we make a recommendation back to the full board on what projects the board should move forward with funding. This has been an effective way over these last 15 years to secure unanimous board action on the funding program. From the staff perspective, from the regional perspective, we see value in this existing approach. One is we see it as a means to implement the long-range plan, the MTP-SES, as I alluded to at the onset. Second, we see it as a way to meet the federal and state performance objectives and policy goals that are placed on the region, that are placed on SACOG. Things that range, for example, from greenhouse gas reduction targets from the state to safety and system performance management targets from the federal government. We've also think that the round helps position the region for other funding, so other competitive programs, mostly at the state and federal level. The region's been successful in bringing over $100 million in those competitive awards at those state and federal programs in the last 2 years. And then finally, a way to maintain the agency's strong delivery record. We're a leader in the state in project delivery, and our round has really emphasized program readiness. Of course, that's a regional perspective on the approach to date, but one of the themes of the staff item is that's just one way to approach it. And we very much recognize there's trade-offs inherent in that approach, and there's other ways to pursue it. And indeed, the round has evolved through time in each cycle. In 2019, which was the last time the board engaged in a funding round, you undertook a similar exercise you're starting today about what are the pros and cons of different approaches to that round, where you really weighed a fully competitive program, a la what's been done the last 15 years, in comparison to a fully formulaic program, which other agencies use, and areas in between, and had that policy discussion, which you'll continue now in 2020, about the pros and cons of each. Ultimately, in 2019, for the prior funding round, you acted for a hybrid approach, which largely maintained the competitive elements of the round. You emphasized streamlining applications, and you did expand some guaranteed funding for programming and project development. For planning and project development. So that's where you landed in your last action a year ago. In building up to this conversation for 2020 round, we have been engaging with stakeholders across the Four-County region. Very much appreciate their time and recognize it's a very busy time. This has been going on for several months, but in the last 2 weeks, it has ramped up a bit, and we had a series of workshops for stakeholders across the Four-County region the last 2 weeks. Not surprising, this is a diverse region. There is a diversity of interests and opinions on the approaches that we could take, or the board could take, to the 2020 round. We did hear some supportive comments. For example, some of the changes we've been making in the last several cycles in terms of application streamlining, this new data tool, which sort of meets a lot of the data requirements of the round, and that theme I talked about a bit earlier about the information and performance-based program at the regional level also translates for the state and federal competitive applications. We've also heard a range of concerns on SACOG's approach to the funding round, and very much appreciate those sponsors and project stakeholders raising those. It's not unique for us to hear concerns on the funding round, especially that this is a very oversubscribed program. Do think we want to emphasize that the concerns seem to be elevated, that they predate the COVID sort of outcomes, and have always sort of been exacerbated by COVID. Again, there's a range of interest and opinion on these, but some in the staff report that we've heard more consistently of concerns on this approach that SACOG's been taking to its funding decisions the last 15 years. One that we've heard strongly from multiple project sponsors is, in a competitive program, the lack of certainty or predictability, especially for agencies as they try to implement their capital improvement programs. The lack of certainty or predictability is a key theme we have heard. Some have also raised concerns about the projects that are funded through the SACOG's regional program may not reflect local priorities. We've heard issues on the time and resources to apply to a competitive program, both on the sponsor side as well as the evaluator side, and then the desire by some for broader transparency in the project evaluation and selection. So again, this speaks to the trade-offs inherent in any of the approaches to the round, but to emphasize the clear feedback from some on interest in more formula funding. The committee had the comments submitted at the end of last week. I'm looking forward to those project proponents to weigh in on their interest in more formula funding, as well in the next month for other stakeholders to weigh in on their interest in the round. So that's one key theme we emphasize in the staff report, is what we've heard to date and engaging with our partners across the Four-County region. The second theme we talk about in the staff report is what's sort of new since the board last engaged in these issues in 2019. We emphasize two issues. The first is a bit more technical. It's the region is in an air quality conformity lockdown. You may recall this being discussed at the end of last year in the context of the adoption of the MTP SES, or long range plan, and that the federal government has invalidated the model that all of California uses to analyze transportation projects. This is not just a SACOG specific issue. Our peers across the state are under the same federal rule. What this means for the funding round itself and your policy deliberation for 2020 is that new projects, expansion projects that are not exempt from air quality conformity analysis, will be difficult or maybe impossible to move forward while we don't have a model recognized from the federal government. But we know we need a pipeline of projects to make sure that the region continues to meet its stellar delivery record. And then the second, of course, issue is COVID. Again, we heard a bit about this, probably every item we've talked about in this committee meeting today, from Loretta to Monica. The uncertainty around sort of sales tax and fuel tax. And in those workshops I alluded to, stakeholders weighed in pretty clearly about concerns about local revenues as well as local resources to develop applications. So those are the two inputs we discuss in the staff report, the feedback we've heard to date, and these sort of new considerations since the board's last deliberation in 2019. Before I jump into the questions that we spoke to in the staff report, just a reminder of next steps. Again, this is just an information item moving to all three committees this month. The board direction we've heard is to employ a similar approach we did last year in 2019, to first start at this high level policy framing with the board to get your feedback. We'll synthesize what we hear from you and your colleagues in the other committees over this month, and we'll come back in June with a staff recommendation on the framework, as well as a fund estimate for the 2020 funding round. We look forward to working with other stakeholders as we incorporate the board's input and putting forward a proposal that we think best represents the board's interest in the 2020 funding round. So that's where we're at. Again, it's the opportunity to weigh in with the board, to hear from you about sort of where you're at with the 2020 funding round. The questions that we spoke to in the staff report really had some of those key themes that we elevated in the report as well as in my presentation today. The first is what interest and what direction you have to give to us as staff in developing our recommendation for the framework that you'll be acting on next month in this key policy question about where you want the round to land, from a competitive to a formulaic sort of range of the spectrum. And since we spent a lot of time in 2019 talking about those sort of bookends, what interest is there from the board in a more sort of hybrid option? And then the second, and again, this speaks to as well, we've been hearing interest from stakeholders across the region strongly indicating desire from their perspective for more certainty and more guaranteed funding. And then the second key question we hope to get some input from you and your colleagues today and on Thursday is there interest at the board level for a potential stimulus type program in this 2020 round, which responds to both COVID and the air quality conformity lockdown. I should emphasize that this would be a stimulus program in the regional transportation funds, i.e. taking a portion of SACOG's discretionary regional funds for a stimulus program, which is different from what you heard about from James about a possible federal stimulus. So what interest is there on the board level to have some portion of the 2020 round be more stimulus oriented? So again, a lot of very sort of meaty policy questions for the committee to consider. A lot to talk through. What we're driving at is coming back next month based on what we hear today with a recommendation on the approach to 2020. So that concludes the staff presentation. I'll turn it back over to the chair, and both Matt and I will be able to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Garrett. Appreciate that very much. Input from directors about the funding rounds for this next year.
I have input.
Yes, go ahead, Director Stollard.
Well, I have pretty strong feelings about this. I've probably been around a long time, as you all know. This is the kind of effort that's coming from the outside that threatens our organization, in my opinion. A group of public works directors feel aggrieved and they're looking for an advantage. And so without going through their city councils, without following their own internal process, they meet, they lobby, and they push an alternative point of view. I don't have any problem with public works directors meeting to discuss public works business, but to try to influence SACOG operational policy in this form, in my view, is not appropriate. I feel we as electeds should be guarding our sovereignty as representatives of the people in establishing policy and not have staff go around us in order to create policy. And I believe that is what's been happening here. I saw it happen 20 years ago. It almost tore the organization apart. 30 or more years ago, it actually did break the organization apart, and Placer went one direction and El Dorado went another. So we have to respect what it takes to keep ourselves unified and moving forward. I've always felt the SACOG staff operate impartially for the benefit of all of us in the region. And we need to respect that. And we really need to hold that dearly, because it's very tentative, in my opinion. If we get a situation where the big jurisdictions see themselves disadvantaged versus the small jurisdictions and try to change policy on that basis, it will destroy our organization. I've always felt that over time, we all get treated fairly. Some years we have better, each of us have a better year than in other years, but that's the way it is. Funding for these projects typically involves multiple years anyway. I also think we have big objectives that are regional in nature that transcend our own parochial interests. And we need to realize that and hold back and not succumb to, I want more, coming from any direction of our membership. And for example, we heard about air quality. I mean, the fact of the matter is we are focused on air quality regionally, multiple air districts, because nobody else does. And so we want to make sure that we are achieving air quality objectives in our funding. And so I personally believe competitive makes sense. We want to encourage behaviors that are going to achieve regional objectives. Whether you like those objectives or not, we don't control federal air quality policy. We don't control state air quality policy. So, you know, our staff recognizes those needs and incorporates them in their decision making. But again, I've always felt they have been fair to all of us. Now, if we can make the application more simple, of course, let's make the application more simple. But at the same time, I really find myself very annoyed that a group of public works directors took it upon themselves to try to change SACOG policy without working with the electeds, without working through the city council. And we haven't got anything from them on anybody's letterhead. So I call it an end run, and I'm not pleased, but I think we as electeds have to protect our own sovereignty and say, we're in control here, we're setting the policy, and let's make sure we're doing it for the right reasons. And when we make changes, let's make sure they're in the interest of the overall organization, because I do not know a single member of our board who does not feel that our organization, I mean, our region is better because SACOG exists. And it's tentative. It depends on all of us recognizing we have a neutral staff, they're doing a good job, they're fair, and that's the way we want to keep it. Thanks for hearing me out.
Oh, thank you, Director Sollard. Actually really appreciate your input and definitely the background that you have serving on this board. Any other directors have comments, input for staff at this point?
This is Mike Kozlowski from Folsom. At the risk of contradicting a couple of things you just said, Tom.
Go ahead. I'm used to it.
Because I'm about to. The Public Works Director in Folsom has kept me apprised of his discussions with others over the entirety of the time that I've been on SACOG. And his personal view, and the one that is shared by the majority of the staff in Folsom, and is not, you know, wildly off the mark in terms of how our city council views things, is that we are very fortunate in Folsom to have had lots of projects funded and to have the resources to compete in a competitive process, right? So we recognize our sort of ability to compete well in this in a competitive scenario. However, those things do have some costs, and they're actually of a mind that doing some portion of the funding by formula, not all, and not in contradiction to our, you know, regional goals, would make some sense, because it would take the pressure off of all of the public works directors and city staffs to not have to compete over and over again for projects that are of regional and local interest, because we have had a history of doing partial funding for things, which is fine. but they would rather know that something has been approved and has been partially funded, and that the next year more of the funding will come without having to recompete that project. So I think it's, there's a lot to unpack in what the letter that they sent, and it's a little bit of overlapping in information. Nothing, at least coming from Folsom, is intent on contradicting our regional goals, okay? Nothing about it is about trying to get an unfair share of the proceeds of any of the funding rounds. In fact, for some certainty, my public works director would be willing to get something less, perhaps, in actual funding. I didn't recommend that he put that in the letter, but it's his position, right? So I think there's a lot packed into that communication, and your perspective is excellent, Director Stollard. But some certainty and some reduction in the burden of applying over and over again would be welcome to the city of Folsom.
Thank you, Mike. Tom, did you want to say something?
I was just going to say, when I first joined the SACOG board in the last century, we all just submitted our projects, and the staff at that time would basically staple them together and call them a plan. Christopher Baldwin likes to comment on that. It was never a plan, and it wasn't achieving important objectives important for the region. So I guess what I'm saying is that's one extreme, and I'm not saying that what's being proposed now is anything close to that. But I want to be careful that we don't ever get back to that. I think it's really important that these decisions be made holistically for the benefit of everybody in the region. And we all have interests in everybody's being successful. My community has more jobs than workers, but half my community still leaves every day and goes to work in other jurisdictions, except when they're sheltering in place. Maybe it'll be fewer after Monica's program gets going. And so in other words, the half of our jobs are filled by people who come from the other communities in the region. This is the way it is. So we need to all care about each other. But we have these overarching objectives. And I just feel like, hey, certainty is great. Who doesn't want certainty? But at the same time, we want to make sure we're adhering to the overall objectives. And when we go asking the legislature for $400 million for Green Means Go, we need to be convincing them that we're doing everything we already can. And I worry that some of these objectives, alternative objectives, will take away from our being able to achieve that 13 or 14% reduction in greenhouse gases. So, either you believe in the whole or you don't. And I believe in the whole. That I don't want to be unfair to Mike's comments, but I just think we need to be careful. If we're not careful, we're going to go back to the way it was, and it's balkanized, and everybody takes their money based on a per capita amount. And all of a sudden, we don't have a plan anymore. We're not operating as intelligently as I think we have come to operate in more recent years. Thank you.
Chair Gore, Rich
Yeah, go
Lozano
ahead.
here. I appreciate Director Stollard's comments as well, but I do have to agree with Director Kozlowski on this. In talking to my public works director over the last several months, one of the issues, I don't want to bring up the same issues Director Kozlowski brought up, but one of the things that was not touched on is I think that at some level, the public works directors feel as though in smaller projects that are on a competitive nature, they find themselves having to add some things in for the project to be a little more attractive that they wouldn't normally need or wouldn't put in the project. And so that's one piece. The other piece is I don't think they're looking, I'm certainly not looking for absolute certainty of the amount of dollars coming into to the region and or our city. But I will say this, having to tie up money for time just to see if we're going to get anything is a problem. And so, again, I respect the fact that SACOG does what they do. I had I've had a conversation with James about this last week, and I just think that if there's a way to do a piece of it, maybe even through the stimulus approach, as a formula, I think it would be a good thing. But on the other hand, again, I understand that we can't look at just our own jurisdictions. It is certainly a regional approach. So, thank you.
Thank you, Rich. Other comments from directors? And I can open this up to the public. I don't think we've got anybody from the public who'd like to make a comment. They haven't at least raised their hand. So with that, Garrett, Matt, you've heard the conversation, and I know you'll be having these conversations with the other committees coming up. So anything else from us on this?
Maybe just to emphasize the point Jarrett made about we will be listening to the other committees and having that conversation on Thursday, and then we'll perhaps offer an update to the board later this month, and then that will help further guide from any further board direction the staff recommendation work that comes forward in June for consideration. We appreciate the questions and the comments today, and duly noted, and we'll move forward with trying to get more input from other board members before we talk to the board later this month.
Great, thank you, Matt. Appreciate that very much. With that, oh yes, I hear somebody.
I'm just going to add, I think everything is, and we certainly appreciate, as I've said to some of you, good discussion, lively, thoughtful debate, right, about this. It's because it's very important. I just want to remind everybody, one of the challenges we have here is that it isn't just simply the cities and counties, right, within the four. It's also the transit providers. It's also Caltrans. So when you think a little bit about a formula or a guarantee, you have to think a little bit about not simply kind of population based, but there's providers out there that are providing benefit. And as Director Stollard said, we have a transportation system that is regional. And so we have to think about not just return to source city by city. We actually have to think about what are the projects that actually accrue regional benefit. And then, and finally, again, some of you know this, but as it says in the memo, we want to be, whatever we do, whatever the board decides that you want to give us direction on, we want to be really mindful of the delivery record that we've had in this region, one of the best in the state. And we want to make sure that, we are actually taking money from other regions that can't deliver projects. That's a little bit about putting funds together, consolidating, putting money on projects that are not only hitting regional goals and state goals, but are also timely and ready to go. I just wanted to make sure that is understood and in the thinking as we go forward on this. Appreciate comments, very much so.
Thank you, James. All right, it looks like we are at the end of our agenda. Any other informational items, James, from you before we adjourn?
No, I think you heard a lot of it from Christina. I was going to add about the the sign-on letter to the governor's task force. But I think, as Christina said, I believe we have 100% participation on this committee, which is excellent for the policy committee. Now we just want to make sure we get as many signatures on there as possible. So thanks very much for engaging in that, and we'll keep you apprised of how all of those efforts go.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for the robust discussion, long meeting, but really appreciate your input. And with that, we will adjourn until our next meeting, which is committee meeting, which is June 4th, likely virtually as well. We'll see. All right. With that, I'll go ahead and adjourn, and we'll see you next time, or actually at the May board meeting.
Thank you, Bonnie.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.